Breakthroughs don't happen because of the medicine. Real breakthroughs happen because someone is scared to death to stop trying. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Mercenary Podcast. This is your host, Nurse Rick speaking. And before we get into today's content, I would just like to let everyone know that themercenary.com is up and running. Themercenaryshop.com is also up and running. So if you're in the healthcare field and you want to check out some merchandise that represents your discipline in the field, go ahead and jump on there. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Without further ado, this week's topic is going to be not a topic of healthcare per se, but it's a historical person that's very important to us nurses. It is the mother of modern nursing, the lady with the lamp. Ladies and gentlemen, this week's episode is on the late, great Florence Nightingale. So, without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Florence Nightingale was born May 12th in 1820 in Florence, Italy, to Francis Smith and William Edward Shore Nightingale. Though she was an English person, her parents had her while on holiday visiting other countries. So they named her after, you guessed it, Florence, Italy. She had one sister as well during their time in their travels. They had a daughter in Parthenope, which they appropriately named Parthenope. So growing up, the family was pretty wealthy. They had two family estates in England, Derbyshire and Hampshire. The girls spent time at both estates, educated at home by their father, learning Greek, Latin, Italian, French, mathematics, history, science, geography, philosophy, and even social science. They were very well-rounded in their education growing up. Florence had no interest in being a typical daughter, though, as opposed to her sister Parthenope, who took interest in the main skills of Victorian women at the time. Florence had no interest in that. She had a call to nursing from a very young age. And with all of her education, she constantly challenged her father on politics and philosophy and other topics as well. She was, from the onset, quite a firecracker. At the age of 16, Florence had received a calling from God to service, to help the vulnerable in society and ease human suffering. Her mother and her father both had objected to this idea, to the belief at the time period that nursing was a low-status job for prostitutes, drunks, and religious women. Her father pushed her towards a life where she was courted by a wealthy suitor to be an ideal Victoria-era woman who stayed home, raised children, and would work around the house. But clearly, Florence had no interest in this life choice. She had many suitors, rejected all of them, though one she had spent over 8 years being courted by, and it's, in today's terms, that's dating. She knew her life's work and her calling to God's service wouldn't be completed if she had just settled into the standard role of a wife of that time period. After years of unrelenting resolve to what she believed to be her life path, her father finally gave his blessing to Florence and sent her to Kaiserwerth, Germany, to study nursing at the Pastor Theodor Fiedner's Hospital and School for Lutheran Deaconesses. During this initial training, she learned most modern treatments of the time period and observed and learned the administrative side of the nursing role in the hospital. After completing her initial schooling in Germany, she traveled to France for further education with the Sisters of Mercy in Paris, France, where she further honed her nursing skills and her administrative expertise. With the formal education and experience done, she was ready for the next step of her life, which was starting her nursing career back home. After returning to England, Florence quickly became a name in the nursing field. Upon arrival back to England in 1853, she was appointed the superintendent of the hospital for distressed gentlewomen in London. During this time in her life, her skills and expertise quickly helped the hospital improve their nursing care, efficiency, and patient outcomes. Her time in this hospital was short-lived, though, not through any fault of her own, but because life had called her elsewhere. In 1854, a high-ranking political friend, Mr. Sidney Herbert, called for her service to the Scutari Hospital in the Crimean War, which is a war fought between Russia and Turkey was backed by their European allies, England included. Due to the horrific nature of more modern weapons of the time period, the injuries were terrible and the mortality rates were high, not to mention the conditions of the wartime hospitals were abysmal, lacking adequate supplies, cleanliness, and experienced staff to take care of the wounded. Florence answered this call to service and led a contingent of 38 nurses to the Scutari Hospital. Upon arrival, she found not only the conditions of the hospital to be hostile, but also the doctors and the military personnel were hostile toward Florence and the nurses that she arrived with. The medical officers and surgeons had essentially kneecapped what Nightingale and her contingent were authorized to do upon their arrival to the hospital. Florence raised concerns with upper brass and was waiting for formal orders to be able to expand their access to the wards of the hospital to start providing better care to patients. While waiting for orders to come down the chain, however, a disaster occurred on the battlefield that would ultimately tie the hands of the medical officers and force them to allow the contingent of nurses to aid the wounded. The battles of Balaclava and Inkerman had left hundreds of soldiers wounded and in need of care. The wounded ultimately overwhelmed the Scutari hospital where Nightingale was serving, to the point where she wrote in her diary that it was, quote, a kingdom of hell, end quote. Faced with this disaster, Florence and her team quickly jumped to serve the severe wounded. Florence quickly established standards of care for sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, and psychological care for patients. She assigned nurses to roles to better help the team and, in turn, their patients. She had nurses in roles such as sewing stump pillows, laundry services, cleaning ward floors and beds, and attaining medical supplies for better patient care. During her time in Scutari, Florence herself was not only an administrator, but was directly involved in patient care, often taking the sickest patients as her own. She would often work 20-hour days with minimal rest for herself. It was at Scutari that she earned the nickname the Lady with a Lamp, due to her night rounds where both patients and medical personnel would see her wandering the halls with a Turkish lantern checking on her patients. It was during the night that she would journal her experiences in her diary and write hospital reports tracking the status of hospital conditions and patient mortality. Within 6 months of her team's arrival to Scutari, it is reported that the hospital's mortality rate dropped from 40% down to 2%. Though some historians, after the fact, debate the accuracy of this statistic, as the Crown of England did want to calm citizens' outrage of the fact that as many soldiers were dying in the hospitals as on the battlefield. Regardless of the true numbers, Nightingale's team did have a profound impact on the quality of care and the outcomes of wounded soldiers. Also during this time, however, Florence herself came down ill with a disease known as brucellosis. She experienced a slow recovery from the disease, but upon recovery would continue with patient care. Ultimately, however, she would experience chronic relapses of severe pain throughout the rest of her life as a result of this disease. Upon returning from the war in Crimea, however, she was recognized as a national hero due to her efforts in wartime. Upon returning from the war in Crimea, however, she was recognized as a national hero due to her hospital efforts in wartime. Florence, however, was not someone who enjoyed the spotlight. She was reported to have entered her home through the back entrance to avoid parades and other celebrations at the conclusion of the war. Though Florence had returned home to England after the war, the chronic effects of brucellosis prevented her from formally returning to patient care in the hospital. However, her biggest contributions were yet to come. Having pre-existing and newly made social and political connections, Florence went to work from home. A gesture of thanks from the Crown was started for Florence, named the Nightingale Fund, started in 1855 and quickly raised £45,000. In today's world, it's over £6 million, or 7.7 million US dollars. This money was at Nightingale's disposal. She started the Nightingale School of Nursing in London, 1860. Her school formalized nursing education and changed the public opinion of nursing as a career from low class to a respectable career in the era. She additionally spent her later years analyzing data and creating reports in the form of the Coxcomb model to analyze mortality and the illness in hospitals. This chart was an early version of the pie chart that we still use today. In this time period, she also wrote her most famous publication, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, which helped to teach non-healthcare workers how to care for the ill at home outside the hospital. Florence then went on to write her second publication, Notes on Hospitals, which largely involved her thoughts on hospital design and construction, taking into account ventilation, lighting, and the spaces of care for different patients with different ailments. While doing all of this, she was also politically active in pushing for social changes in India, which at the time was under the rule of the British Crown. She pushed for changes to public sanitation and health that ultimately led to improvements in the British colonies of the time period. Florence lived to the ripe age of 90 and had been so profound in fulfilling her life's calling that she received numerous awards and recognitions before and after her death, including Lady of Grace by Order of St. John, the Order of Merit, being inducted into the British National Statistics Society, and the Red Cross after her death dedicated an award to her name, the Florence Nightingale Medal. And the coup de grace of her contributions is a celebrated week every year leading up to her birthday, National Nurses Week, celebrated every year since 1965 around the world. Florence was a brilliant woman with an insurmountable dedication to her mission to help heal others and ease human suffering. Of all things that she did in her life, she did it all for one reason: for the good of others. Well, listeners, that's going to do it for this week's topic of conversation. You learned about the life and the accomplishments of Florence Nightingale, the mother of modern nursing, the lady with the lamp, the person that created the framework for what we all practice in today as nurses. She was an amazing woman, and every year we celebrate her for that remarkable reason. However, that's going to do it for this week's topic. I would leave you guys a fun fact, but I feel like the past 10 minutes has just been full of fun facts that none of you probably knew. We learned a little bit about her in nursing school, but this research brought out a whole lot of new knowledge that I think is quite telling of why we do things the way we do. And I, for one, am very, very happy that she chased her calling in life, because it made the world a better place for a lot of people that were in need of fantastic care. So, in ending this episode, I would just like to remind you guys, go check out the website and the socials. And thank you for listening. And I will see you guys in the next episode.